recording on. Let's see if that works. And if you will, I would invite you to mute. Why don't everybody mute your phone or your computer? And if you want to jump in, just remember you'll need to unmute. That way we'll control our background noise. So if you will mute, that will be helpful. And I'll go ahead and share my screen again. Okay. Okay, officially, good morning, everyone. And great to see everyone and hear everyone. Last week we had some audio challenges, but it sounds like everything is good this morning. So we will go ahead and get started. Hope you're navigating well, given our continued battle against this virus. I know it's very difficult for everyone, but it's good that we have the technology that we have to get on this morning and have a little time together. We always at Central begin our class with a prayer. I thought we'd do that this morning as well. Does anyone have, I know Sharon is still recovering, Sharon Nichols and Kip, Bill, Alan, and Dee. And so are there any others that anyone wants to mention this morning? If you want to come off mute and give me a name or two, that'll be helpful.
Steve, our grandson Kip, is recovering. And in fact, he has started donating plasma this week for research, but also as a treatment for other virus patients. And he'll be doing this for 3 weeks, twice a week for 3 weeks.
Very good. Thanks, Steve. Appreciate you sharing that. Good to hear that he's doing better. Okay, if we will then, hearing
there's Sullivan's grandfather. I believe she lost her grandfather last week as well.
Said Sullivan, yeah, I saw that in the bulletin. By the way, Keaton sent the bulletin yesterday, so.
And I wanted to mention to our brethren in India. I continue to correspond with Roy through WhatsApp. Some of his comments actually get deleted because they kind of watch that closely, any kind of criticism that might be leveled, if you will. And while Roy is never critical, he sometimes makes comments on the government. Anyway, it just reminds me of the tough situations that he and his family live in, trying to be Christians in a non-Christian world. They get it from many different directions, and then of course the coronavirus is starting to spread there quite rampantly, and there's just lots to be concerned, and yet they as a family and as a church have continued to reach out to people in need. So I want to continue to remember them.
Thanks, Mitch. Anyone else? Okay, let's join together in prayer as we begin our class this morning. Father in heaven, we ask for your hand of healing and continued guidance and oversight for those that we've just been sharing among the group. Certainly Kip and his recovery, we want to thank you for that and his willingness to share with others in that recovery and in a medical way. Father, we want to remember Sullivan and that family and the death of her grandfather. Also want to lift up Roy and his family and the church in India and the difficult time in terms of the oppression, but more specifically today, those there that may be battling COVID-19 in an area where medical support is very challenged. We know that's a very difficult situation. We lift up those there to you as well. We want to thank you for Sharon Nichols' recovery from her surgery and be with her as she continues that recovery. We're thinking of those that do attend our class at Central that are also challenged with their health. Bill Dykes, as he continues to battle his health problems, and be with Alan Stewart. Alan is in Atlanta this weekend and back there for more information and treatments. And Father, we know what being shut in is about, and more as we continue the shelter in place. And we just want to remember all those that we know that are among those that are known by those hearing my prayer this morning that are shut in, that are unable to get out even when there is no COVID shelter in place. We think about Danny, we think about Mildred, and the many others that we know would, like us, like to be out. Father, we know there are important decisions that are made every day by our government and by our leaders. Continue to be with them, guide the physicians, the nurses, the first responders who have been and will continue to be on the front lines of saving people from this virus. Father, also we pray for researchers that are looking for a cure. May you expedite that search. And give us each peace, greater joy, in spite of these circumstances. Help us to find, as we say, the silver lining in this time. And Father, we also thank you for the technology that we're using today. Without this, we would not be able to see each other and hear each other. But also, Father, remind us today that church is about people. It's not about buildings. And as it was in Nehemiah's day, it wasn't really about the temple or the walls, but it was about people back then as well. Ask you to continue to be with us, and bless our families, bless those that we know. It's through Jesus that we offer this. Amen. All right, we have a couple more people, it looks like, that are coming in, so I'll let them in. All right, so it looks like we have about 15 on the call today, so that's very good. Again, want to thank all those who are joining, have joined. Hello, Keaton.
Hey, Steve. And Kyla.
Hi.
Hey, Kyle. Hey, Kyle. So we're asking everyone to go on mute that's joining, and that way we have 18 folks on the call. So if you have a comment or want to answer a question, certainly jump in and do that. I want to admit a couple more here. All right, very good. So it's obviously April 12th. I'm sure that when COVID-19 came into our lives, we probably thought we would all be together on April 12th, and we are not. It may not be for several weeks. We're not really sure about that, but we certainly put safety first. But I want to wish everyone a happy Easter. I've heard those wishes around the call this morning, but just to get us started today, chapter 13 of Nehemiah. We've been talking about this book now for about 3.5 months, and this week, an interesting chapter about the reforms that Nehemiah actually came back to Jerusalem and made. And then we'll also be doing a wrap up as well at the end of our time this morning. I wanted to share with you, probably send this PowerPoint deck out with our recording later on. So you'll have this to refer back to, maybe if you want to make notes in the margin of your Bible. These are the words.
Turn that light on, please.
Sorry? There you go. These are the words that define or sort of give us an overview of each chapter. You can see these 1 through 12. Last week, the chapter was about praise. This week, another word that begins with the letter P. And just curious if you want to buy a couple of vowels there. Anyone want to venture a guess on what this chapter is outlined with by using a word that begins with the letter P? Any guesses?
Prophecy.
Well, it has 8 letters. Not sure about prophecy, but that's a good guess, but not the word I was thinking about. Let me help a little bit more, give you a couple more letters. R and an S. We're really playing the game today, aren't we? Think about the reforms. There's a key. This book is about the reforms.
You know what the word is?
Say that again. Do we have another guess? 8 letters.
Process.
No.
Well, that's a good guess. But it's wrong, David. Sorry.
Problems.
Problems.
Yeah, I got it.
So, chapter 13 is about problems. And again, because there are 4 reforms, Nehemiah goes away actually for, we didn't know how long, it might have been as much as a decade, but he comes back to Jerusalem and he addresses these 4 problems that we're going to talk about today. Before we do that, by way of introduction, this is an easy question. What's this? It's a TV, right? Y'all see the TV. Doesn't look a lot like the TV probably you have in your house, because this TV looks more like a TV from maybe the 1970s or 1980s. It's not a 70-inch flat screen. It's an older model. It's probably
All those people know.
one that you recognize, though, many of you. You know, some TV shows are popular because they keep viewers kind of coming back week after week with a technique that they call cliffhangers. You know, TV shows that end in a cliffhanger, and then they get you to come back the next week and watch because they answer the question or the situation that they were posing last week. So I Googled cliffhangers, and there are lists on the internet about really famous cliffhangers. And there was a show several decades ago that you might be familiar with. Some of you are. I see you smiling. The show Dallas. Remember that show? I think it was ran for quite a number of years. And there was one particular episode in the early 1980s that was really famous for this technique called the cliffhanger. It was one of the more earlier times that this technique was used to bring people back to the next episode. In this case, I think it was actually the next season, because it was right at the end of a season. I think the summer was maybe about 1980. I was very, very small at that time, but I've heard about this since then. Does anybody Does anybody know? Does anybody know what that cliffhanger was?
Who shot JR?
Who shot JR? Who said that?
Ricky and David.
Yeah. Oh, some of the more senior members of our call today. That's right. That's the correct answer. Who shot JR? And so as we think about the book of Nehemiah, we're on the last chapter, chapter 13. I just wanted to kind of share that so that we would be thinking, back over the past weeks, and how I hope that from week to week, because you were seeking kind of resolution, you kept reading the next chapter to see, what was next in the book. So today we are going to pick up in the final chapter. And you remember last week's chapter was about a big celebration and a dedication. As you read through this chapter, what did you think? What did you think about this chapter as compared to last week's chapter? Anyone have a thought about it? If you do, you can go off mute and share. Well, not that any one of us would do this, but if we were going to paraphrase the book, we're going to rewrite it. Or let's make it more exciting. If we were going to make this book into a movie, I don't know that I wouldn't prefer to stop in chapter 12 than go on and make the movie about chapter 13 and end there. I'll tell you, here's where I would stop this movie or this book. If I just had my choice, it would have been last week, actually. It would have been last week, not this week. And it would have been at this verse. Anyone want to read chapter 12, verse 43? Should be on the screen.
So
And on
simple.
that day, they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away.
Thanks, Mitch. So that was our sort of the crescendo for our lesson last week. It's also really the climax of the book, where all of these men, women, and children, they sang, they marched around the top of the wall, they were celebrating. And this comes after 12 chapters of 7 prayers, masterful planning and execution by Nehemiah and his team of builders, a king's support, builders' commitment staring in the face of death, performance unmatched, the wall built in 52 days. I mean, we can go on with the successes and the reforming of the people's faith in the latter part of the book. We get to chapter 12, and here is sort of the climax of the entire writing of Nehemiah. And then, oddly, perhaps, comes along another chapter after this great celebration. I thought about this week as saying, if it would have ended in chapter 12, verse 43, it would be like the story, and they lived all happily ever after. But that's not where the story ends. So today we're going to move on to chapter 13. And as we do that, I want to just kind of jump forward to chapter 13, verses 6 and 7. If I can, I'll remind everyone to be on mute unless you want to give an answer or make a comment. Appreciate that. Chapter 13, verses 6 and 7 say, "But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem." And the going on is what we're going to be talking about here For in the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later, I'd asked his permission to come back to Jerusalem. So this sets kind of the setting for chapter 13. At the end of 12, after this celebration, it seems that Nehemiah had gone back to Persia for some reason. We don't know exactly why, other than we remember that he told King Artaxerxes that he'd be back. He would come back. He didn't know when, but he would be back. And so he goes back to Persia for a period of time. And some scholars have said it may have been as many as 10 or 12 years. But for whatever reason, after that period of time, he doesn't write about that in his book. He comes back to Jerusalem. And so what was going on? Well, he left, things were in place. The covenant had been signed in chapter 10. Things were good. The people had been reformed. The wall was built. The temple was in place. He probably thought it was time to go back. I'm wondering, it's not written, but I'm wondering if there was, he got some wind that things weren't quite so good in Jerusalem, so he needed to go back. But we get the sense in chapters 8 through 13 of this book that really the Jews, and this is kind of one of the underlying themes of obviously the entire Old Testament, but the Jews really do struggle with their faith and their commitment to the Pentateuch, the law of Moses. And so as I thought about that, I thought about this verse. Who would like to read these 3 verses from Hebrews chapter 10? If you will, come off mute and read these for us.
I'll read it. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. Otherwise, would they not have stopped being offered? For the worshipers would have been cleansed once for all and would no longer have felt guilty for their sins. But those sacrifices are an annual reminder of sins.
Yeah, so obviously, thanks, Don. Hebrews is a great book. Mitch had a study about Hebrews a little over a year ago. It really brings together the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this book of Nehemiah is really probably more than we've talked about, a book that does that. And so I always think about Nehemiah when I think about this word here that I have highlighted. The law is only a shadow. It's not the reality. It's not what? The real thing. It's a shadow of the good things that are coming. And of course, we have the benefit of being able to look back through that lens. Nehemiah and the people of that day, the Jews, didn't have that lens. From the early chapters, there was construction. From the later chapters, there was instruction. But it seems like with the Jews, all of those Jews that have returned from exile back to Jerusalem, there seems to be this notion that they just cannot escape the sin. They move away from it. They're very sorrowful, but they always kind of keep coming back to it. It reminds me of this story. Most of you probably heard this story. If you throw a frog in a boiling pot of water, it'll jump out. Now, I've never done that, but that's what the research says. But you put those same 2 frogs in a pan of water that's warm or lukewarm, and you turn up the heat. Over time, they'll not feel it. And to me, that resonates with regard to Jews, and maybe even some of us today, as we think about being desensitized to sin, and not really feeling it as we go along. It just seems incredible to me that these people went through what they did to rebuild the temple, rebuild the wall, rededicate their lives, sign this covenant, and then we find them in chapter 13 completely away from it. How does that happen? How does that happen? And so I think it can be explained a little bit through this boiled frog phenomenon. That over a period of time, if we don't do the right things and aren't reminded of the right things, and challenged to do the right things, we end up this way. So moving on from that then, what are these reforms in chapter 13? There are 4 of them, as we said earlier. You know, Nehemiah uses a technique as he addresses these difficult situations. And I wouldn't minimize these. You know, I feel for Nehemiah here. I feel for Ezra. Ezra may not be alive at this time. But think about the effort, the time, the fight with Tobalot and Sanballat, all that's happened, only to find in the very last chapter, he has to come back and bring them one more time out of a bad place, back to the law. And that's what these 4 reforms are about. There are 4 of them: temple reform, financial reform, I call it priority reform, and relationship reform. So the first one is, and you might say, why chapter 10? Why chapter 10? I put 2 chapters up here for a very specific reason. And that is, every one of these violations for which the people get rebuked, that's the first thing you find Nehemiah doing. He calls out what's wrong, and then he rebukes them, and then he brings them back to the right place. And I'm trying to follow that same sort of outline here. And because of time, we'll kind of quickly walk through these. But the first ones in the first 5 verses, between verse 4 and verse 9, is called temple reform. And this we kind of think about as compromised companionship. So what's going on here? The high priest Elisha allows Tobiah. Now, if you've been with us in past studies, that's a name you recognize, Tobiah. He's one of a couple, maybe 3 men who really gave the Jews a lot of trouble in rebuilding the wall. But sometime after Nehemiah leaves, this high priest, Elisha, allows Tobiah to actually come in and occupy several rooms in the temple. And that's a violation, and it also crowds out a lot of the space for the people to bring their grain offerings and the like that they were commanded to do. And so Nehemiah basically throws Tobiah out of the temple and says, and reminds the people that back in Nehemiah chapter 10, do you remember that this is part of the covenant that you agreed to, that you would keep the temple a certain way, and that you would have rooms to store the grain and the various offerings in? And so Nehemiah 10:37, in the interest of time, I'll just read that for us quickly. This goes back to, again, the chapter where the people signed the agreement. You'll remember it was 84 different individuals. And in verse 30, and really beginning in about verse 28 to 30, through the end of the chapter, it talks about the specific provisions of this agreement. And in verse 37, Nehemiah says, moreover, we will bring to the storerooms of the house of God for the priests the first fruits of our ground meal, our grain, our offerings, the fruit of all the trees, and of our new wine and oil. And we will bring a tithe of our crops to the Levites, for the Levites will collect these where they work, and they'll use those for the offerings that needed to be made. So what had happened here, and this leads us into the second reform, the people stopped doing that because Tobiah was allowed to take over a part of the temple, and so there was no room for these resources. So what happens? So the Levites go out and they return to the fields and they do their work and they neglect their duties in terms of the offerings that were supposed to be made. And so in verse 32 of chapter 10, we assume the responsibility for carrying out the commands to give a third of a shekel each year for the service of the house of our Lord. That was one of the agreements that the people made. They weren't following it. And maybe letting Tobiah there was their way out of that requirement. I didn't really know. But it created a need for Nehemiah to come back and correct that problem. There was also another problem. The third problem was they had secularized the Sabbath. In chapter 10, verse 31, they committed. They would not work or sell goods on the Sabbath. But we find in verses 15 through 22 of this chapter that they were doing that. They were allowing people from the region around Jerusalem to come into Jerusalem and sell fish and sell all other kinds of merchandise on the Sabbath. Nehemiah is definitely a man of action on that one as he comes to deal with these men. He says in verse 31 of chapter 10, the commitment that had been made. There it says, when the neighboring peoples bring merchandise or grain to sell on the Sabbath, we will not buy from them. This was their agreement back in chapter 10. Will not buy from them on the Sabbath or any other holy day. And so they clearly go against that. I don't know. You have to kind of read between the lines to answer the question why. Why did they do this? Again, I go back to kind of the boiled frog phenomenon. Perhaps they let the visitors in. They were losing. Perhaps the fish was rotting. Perhaps it was an opportunity to make more money. However they rationalized allowing it to happen, it broke their commitment to God in terms of the Old Testament law. So Nehemiah has to rein them back in one more time. The chapter ends with relationship reform, domestic disobedience. But some of the people had married women from quote unquote foreign areas, Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. And as a result, some of the children could not even speak Hebrew, so they could not be taught appropriately. And this was, again, a commitment back in chapter 10 that they promised not to do this. They promised not to marry outside of the Jewish race. But they got away from that as well. And of course, Nehemiah in chapter 13 calls them back, and he says in verse 26, was it not because of marriages like these that Solomon, king of Israel, sinned? So Nehemiah does his best when he gets back to right the wrongs in Jerusalem. There's a lot going on there. And again, I'm not sure how he would felt about that, but he certainly took things into his hands to get them back on the right path one more time. We began this study because at Central, our theme for this year is all in. And as I think about this particular chapter, again, why could it have not ended at chapter 12, happily ever after with the celebration? It doesn't, because the people, they slide away. And I just have to ask the question, and we've just answered it, but yes, the walls were rebuilt, the temple was rebuilt, but this other section of the book, restoring lives, it doesn't seem to had been the case that the Jews were all in. They just were not all in.
And in Nehemiah, the wall was going to be rebuilt.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Did I say something?
Yeah, somebody's not on mute. I'm not sure who, but yeah, that's right. It starts with the walls, and that goes reasonably well, but restoring of the lives doesn't go as well. And I think this chapter really says for us, they were not really all in. And that's the question for us as we think about this book. Do we see ourselves as, in the lives of these Jews, as kind of coming and going with regard to our spirituality? And so it's just something to think about as we think about really the ups and downs, the ebbs and the flows of the people. Nehemiah, I thought about him because I think he's a great example for what we know about someone who was all in, but he doesn't seem, at the end of the day, to be able to get the people there. And I think the reason is we know that the people aren't going to get there because we know the rest of the story. We've talked about that a bit this morning from the book of Hebrews. This book itself also has certainly a foreshadow of that as well. And so where does that leave us at the end of 13 chapters, a study over 3.5 months? What about a summary? What about a wrap-up? What would that look like? Well, it's the first Sunday, for those of you that have been with us every Sunday, that I didn't start with this particular overhead, this wrapping that really outlines the book. And the reason is, we don't need to, because you've seen this 11 times. So my thought was today, as we think about wrapping up our study, but let's do it a different way. Let's look at this timeline. Now, it's just a timeline I listed from the internet. There are many of them out there if you want to go look. This makes it easier for me to figure out where some of these books fit, because the Bible isn't put together in chronological order, right? Everyone understands that. You cannot read it from cover to cover without jumping around if you want to stay sort of in the moment as to how it actually happened. You'd have to buy what they call a chronological Bible. I have one right here beside me. And I just want to kind of begin our summary with this chart. And this will take maybe 10 minutes to wrap up. So look here at this chart right here in the center. Here is where the book of Nehemiah fits in this timeline from Genesis to really through the end of the New Testament. You can see that right here. It's on this timeline. It's around the mid 400s. Last week we talked about it being 445 BC roughly. You say, well, what does that have to do with me? I'm living in 2020. Well, most people didn't realize that. Let me grab my Bible over here and share this. Nehemiah is in my Bible on page 920. Matthew starts in my Bible on page 1638. But on the timeline, look at this. Nehemiah is about the last book of the Old Testament that was actually written. The only book that rivals it for that position is what? Malachi. Now, Malachi is in the back of the Old Testament, right? But I'm going to hold this up. That's how many pages that are between Nehemiah in my Bible and Matthew. The story of the Gospels, the story of the birth of Jesus and his life, death, burial, resurrection, that topic that will be talked about in hundreds of thousands of places around the globe today. Think about that. There are 800 pages between Nehemiah and Matthew in our Bibles. I say that to say this. Nehemiah is really almost the last history we have in the Old Testament. And it sort of butts up to the New Testament. And we know what happens in the New Testament. Jesus comes. Jesus comes. So we've spent 3.5 months studying the book and really haven't talked about that. The story of Nehemiah is very close to what we call the 400 years of intertestamental time, right? It's that last biblical record before Jesus comes. But of course, Nehemiah is not the end. So I wanted to wrap up with this thought in mind. I alluded to this group of scriptures last week when we were talking about chapter 12. I knew that I want to talk about it in a little more detail today, so I didn't really cover it in a lot of detail last week. But you can see that here. It talks about in verse 16, this is Colossians 2, it talks about these religious festivals and the celebrations and the Sabbath day, how these are, Paul writing, again, about 500 years after Nehemiah wrote, saying these are here's that word again. What's that word? The word in red. These are a shadow. These are a shadow. What are these? The very things that Nehemiah spent a good part of his life trying to bring the Jews back to, the Old Testament law. These were shadows of things to come. The reality, however, is Jesus. The reality is Jesus. And that's what all of this is about. That's why I say this is the summary of the book of Nehemiah. The story doesn't end with the celebration of the dedication of the law. It doesn't end with 4 reforms and the people falling out of favor from following the law. The story, the rest of the story is right here. That was a step in time to get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the beginning of the church in Acts. And if we want to be really specific about it, our lives today are a continuation of the reality that Paul wrote about in Colossians 2:17. Our lives are not a shadow. Our walk is not a shadow because we have the word. And that is the difference. We wouldn't have it if people like Nehemiah would not have done what they did. And so where do we go from there? In verse 20, since you have died with Christ, these elemental issues, why would you live as though you need to submit to these rules and regulations? So there's the transition verse. We know Christ died, he was buried, and he was raised. But if you have been the same, died, buried, and were raised in baptism, then why think about those things? Why be tied down by those things? Why let them be a ball and chain today? Paul goes on to write, since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. Why? Because we've died. Our lives are hidden with Christ in God. So when Christ, who is your life, appears, then you and I will also appear with him in glory. Effectively, the book that we've studied about is incredible, and it's necessary because it was a step to get us to where we are today. And that's why it's important. It's not necessarily important that it was written in a certain time by Nehemiah or any of those things. Those all are true, but those things precede the history of the gospel. Nehemiah, he restored a wall. He tried to restore a people, but the most important thing is it was the foreshadow of the Savior, so that one day all of us on this call can see him and be with him in all of his glory and our glory as well. So rather than going back through chapters 1 through 12 and doing a summary, I think in particular, although we celebrate Jesus every week, on a weekend where the world focuses on Easter and this event in history, which I think that's still a good thing. I think it's appropriate that we put it in the right context, and that is that Nehemiah helps us take one more step back to the cross. So that's sort of the wrap up for today, and I thought I'd just give you one last graphic as a reminder of why we call into a call like this. It's not because of Nehemiah, but it's because of Jesus. So I've enjoyed teaching the class. I know that we had to sort of do a left turn here in the middle of it, but I think it was good to kind of keep it going, and the fact that it was going gave us an opportunity to come together and have an ongoing conversation about what we've been talking about in February, in January, February, and March. So I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Any last thoughts or questions about Nehemiah or chapter 13? I'll put everybody back on. So anyone that wants to share? Hearing none. Again, it was good to be with you today. Hope you continue to have a safe time, and in about 10 minutes or so, check out Facebook Live and listen to Keaton as he presents Sunday morning message. Thanks all.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate you putting this all together. It's been a good way to keep things rolling while we've all been separate from the building.
Thanks, Mitch. Appreciate you. Yeah.
Steve, I have a prayer request. It's one of Julia, my granddaughter Julia. One of her classmates' father died Friday from the virus. I don't know their names, but if you would just raise them up in prayer, please.
All right, everyone make a note of that. Keaton, if you will, and may you always have a prayer in our sermon time, if you'll remember Julia's classmate's father. Thanks, Polly, for sharing that. We'll remember the family.
And
Enjoy your class.
Steve,
Thanks, Polly. I appreciate it. Yeah, Dan.
Steve, can you hear me?
Yes.
Also, Martha Hughes, I think everybody knows her. She did find out she does have Parkinson's disease.
Oh.
So please keep her in your prayers too.
Okay.
Okay. Martha Hughes.
Okay.
Former member at Central with Parkinson's disease. She found out recently, maybe this past week, about that. So a couple of others. Anyone else as we wrap up? Appreciate
Thank you, Dave.
Hey,
Yeah.
Steve.
Thanks, Diane. Appreciate it.
Steve, if anybody's interested because of safety's sake, and they have to go to the grocery stores, if they do not have a mask that they want to wear, Judy is making some. She will make a homemade mask. If you just give her a call, she'd be glad to do it for you if you don't have anything.
Thank you.
David, I think we all heard that. Who did you say?
Judy Klein.
Oh, Judy Klein. Thanks.
I've got
Thank you.
I'm a homemade mask. You'll never guess what's on it, but anyhow.
Okay. All right. Good. Thanks, David. Appreciate that.
Oh, I was going to say, if anybody needs somebody to go to the store for them, I would do it. So,
Thank you. Thank you, Sammy.
Yeah.
Sammy.
Thanks, Samantha. Appreciate that.
Sammy, thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's my only sane part of the day is when I can go with the seniors to the store.
Go in the early hour. Go in the early hour. Anything else? Again, it's good to see everyone. We're about 6 minutes away from 1/2 the hour, so we'll sign off and let Keaton get ready to do his lesson for the morning. Thank you all. Be safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.